Welcome back for more physiology. We're going to continue our talk on how we breathe, and we're going to deal with the gases involved in breathing, or what we call gas exchange. So in particular, we're going to look at hemoglobin and pressure and how both of those things are involved in gas exchange. From last time, I mentioned that we turn out to have these centers that are involved in regulation. And it's part of your base of your brain, or your medulla. What we'll notice is we have things that will detect how much your lungs stretch or how much they aren't stretched. We'll look at muscles and see where they are contracted or they relaxed. But we'll also look at things like what's the pressure inside of your aorta, or what is the chemical composition of your blood inside of your aorta or inside of your carotid arteries. In particular, we're looking at your acid composition. Why would we be doing that? Because that's going to tell us something about how much gas exchange is going on. So your brain, for breathing, detects your blood. And that, in part, will influence your heart rate, but it also will influence how much you're breathing. So the gases that we care about, there are a whole bunch of gases. So the primary ones that we're going to deal with are oxygen and CO2. But there are others in the air. Most of the air is nitrogen gas. So it'd be kind of responsible to talk a little bit about nitrogen. But it's not necessary. But if we look at this picture here, what this is showing us is how easy is it to dissolve gases. So I know it has methane and carbon monoxide and helium, which we don't care too much about. How easy is it to dissolve these things inside of water? Blood is 90% plasma, or it's 55% plasma, and the plasma is 90% water. So your blood's water. So if we look at your plasma, or the water of your blood, or your extracellular fluid, and what we notice is from this curve, it curves down as we move to the right, meaning the higher the temperature, the less likely you are to get these gases to dissolve. You know this because if you get a soda and you leave it out in a room that's warm, it goes flat because all the gas leaves. It's not going to stick around inside of a warm soda. We have the exact same issue inside of our bodies. We're at 37 degrees Celsius, which means we're going to have an issue holding on to CO2 and oxygen, which means we need to have some tricks to keep this stuff around. Turns out for carbon dioxide, there is a trick, and it's referred to as the carbonic anhydrase reaction. We have an enzyme inside of our body, which is just a protein that speeds up reactions. It's a catalyst. And what it does is it takes CO2 and water, combines the two together to form something that we call carbonic acid. Acids, as you recall from chemistry, immediately fall apart. You're going to lose a proton, and what we end up getting is what we call bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, or the proton, which is where the acid part shows up. This turns out to be a way that we can hide CO2. We don't need to worry about it dissolving in water and having actual CO2. We can hide it in a different chemical form, either acid or as this thing that we call bicarbonate. That's baking soda, by the way. So CO2, we have a way to hide it. We'll deal with oxygen in a moment. When I look at gas exchange, what I need to worry about is pressure, because pressures are going to drive everything. Blood flows from high to low pressure. The way that we get air inside of our lungs is we lower the pressure inside of our lungs. High pressure on the outside, lower pressure inside of your lungs, air moves in. Way we exhale, we increase the pressure in our lungs. Pressure in your lungs is greater than the outside, so air flows out. If I'm looking at CO2 or I'm looking at oxygen, I need to talk about the pressure of oxygen, the pressure of CO2. The catch is, I can't just pluck out the oxygens in the air and just say, okay, let me figure this one out just for them. That's not possible. So what we do is we apply a rule called Dalton's Law. And Dalton's Law says, effectively, if you know the percent composition of a gas mixture, like the air is about 20% oxygen. If I know the pressure of the air, which is, in this particular case, it says 101.3, which is 101.3 torr, which is a unit of pressure. It's like saying 1 atmosphere or 760 millimeters of mercury or 30 inches of mercury. What it's saying is, if I were to take 20% of that 101.3, because oxygen's 20%, and the total air pressure is 101.3 torr. So if I take 20% of that 101.3, what I will get is that 20.9. And that would be the pressure in the air due to oxygen. Nitrogen's about 78% of the air, so I take 78% of the 101.3 and I get the 78.1. Okay, if I do that for every gas in the air and add up all those pieces, ultimately what do I get? I get 101.3. So it's a way of saying, let's talk about the parts. So I could pluck out the CO2 part of the air and I could pluck out the oxygen part of the air, and we could talk about pressures of those. When we do that, what we need, I know this picture looks terrifying. It's not that terrifying. What we do is we can look at how how these gases move based upon a pressure gradient. What's our goal? We want to get oxygen from the outside into our tissues, into our cells. Well, how do you do that? The highest pressure of oxygen must be out in the air, and the lowest pressure must be where our tissues are, or in our cells. So if I look at this picture here, here's what I see. Inhaled air, the pressure of oxygen turns out to be 160 millimeters of mercury. Inside of your lungs, it's 104. Okay, so it's going to move from air into your lungs. If you compare your lungs to your bloodstream, blood going into your lungs has a partial pressure of 40. Oh, okay, so I guess that means oxygen will go from your lungs into your bloodstream. Got it. So then it's going to flow on around. You'll notice that the blood that leaves turns out to also have a partial pressure of 104 because all you can do is make a match. You can't get more than what you put in. So that 104 is going to travel on down until you get to your tissues. There it's going to be, here they're listing as 100, but 100, 104. Your tissues are at 40. So what is it going to do? It's going to go from your blood, it being oxygen, it's going to go from your blood into your tissues. Isn't that what our goal was in the first place? Yeah. So it just follows a pressure gradient. Yeah, that's exactly what it does. If I look at CO2, I want it to go from my cells into the environment, which means the highest pressure of CO2 must be in my cells and the lowest must be in the environment. So what do we notice? If we look at our tissues, they're at a 45. The blood's at a 40. Okay, 45 is bigger than 40. CO2 goes into your bloodstream, travels on out till you get to your lungs. And your lungs, it's pressure of 40. Well, 45 is bigger than a 40. So this CO2 is going to go into your bloodstream or go into your lungs. Well, 40 is bigger than the air that you breathe out, which is a 27. Partial pressure of CO2 is 27. So the CO2 is going to go from your lungs into the air you breathe out. And if you look at the air that you breathe out, which has a partial pressure of 27 millimeters of mercury, the atmosphere is a 0.2. So yeah, it's going to then spread. We went from a 45 to a 0.2. Yeah, that sounds like CO2 is going to leave us. That's the point. That's all we're trying to get at. CO2 has a trick, and that trick is it can turn into carbonic acid. Oxygen, turns out, doesn't have that trick. Oxygen, about 3% of it can remain dissolved in your blood, inside of the water aspect of your extracellular fluid, but that's not going to help us out. So what we need is an extra step, something additional to help us move around oxygen. And that thing is a pigment, a colored molecule called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is made out of 4 chunks of protein that are glued together. 2 of them are identical, the other 2 are identical. In the middle they have something called heme. A heme group is a big funky looking structure that has an iron in the middle. Okay, so it has an iron in the middle. Good for it. With that iron, what it can do is grab onto oxygen. And the result is we now have an oxygen carrying device. How much can it hold? Well, that turns out to depend on a few things. If I increase the pressure of oxygen, so the amount of oxygen surrounding us, the more I can shove onto hemoglobin. But it also turns out to be affected by your body's pH. So this curve here shows something called the Bohr effect. The middle curve, the one in the middle of the 3, that's what your body normally does. So if at your lungs, the pressure of CO2 or of oxygen turns to be 100 millimeters of mercury, if You go up to the top and go across, that's like 95% saturated. That's pretty good, meaning 95 parts out of every 100 parts of hemoglobin are filled to the brim with oxygen. Awesome. When we get to your tissues had a partial pressure of 40 for oxygen. So if I go down to a partial pressure of 40 for oxygen, go up to the curve, that's at like, 60%? I know it's more than 60%, but 60%? So that means between your lungs and your tissues, you're going to lose 35% of what your hemoglobin can hold. Your hemoglobin started out holding 95 parts out of every 100. When we get to your tissues, it's going to say, okay, and it's going to dump out more of the hemoglobin, or it's going to dump out more oxygen. Are you out of oxygen? No, you still have 60 parts left, just in case you need it. Well, when would you need it? You probably would need it if your body is making a lot of CO2. A lot of CO2 equals a lot of acid, and what that does is it shifts the curve to the bottom one that says high CO2 or the low pH. So if I were to look at that, so you're exercising, you're making a lot of CO2. So you start out at 100, you're at 95% saturated. Hooray. But you're exercising a lot, you make lots of CO2. If I go to your body tissues, it's still going to be at 40, but that curve, when you drop over, that goes to 50% saturation. What does that mean? Your body, because it's making a lot of CO2, is going to demand an additional 10% of the oxygen. Well, why would you do that? If you have lots of CO2, you're doing a lot of chemistry, and a lot of chemistry requires a lot of oxygen. So we have a mechanism that adjusts how much oxygen you need based upon how much CO2 you produce. It turns out we don't know how much oxygen we have in our bodies. So if we were in a room and we sucked all the oxygen out, we wouldn't know. We'd go, I'm tired, and then we'd just all fall asleep and die. If we move and replace the oxygen with CO2, our bodies are incredibly sensitive to this. So much so that you will feel like you don't have any air. And the result, because what happens to your hemoglobin? It gets rid of all of its oxygen. The result of that is you start hyperventilating. Or you're going to start gasping for air and you're going to want more air and you're just not going to be able to get it, which is kind of fun. If you hyperventilate and it's not because of no CO2, but you're hyperventilating because you're freaking out over something, what happens there? Well, you're breathing out lots of CO2. Lots of CO2 means you're losing lots of acid, which means your body becomes more basic, and that actually makes the curve shift to the left, which is the higher curve. Well, what do we notice about that? Rather than it stopping at the 60%, it actually stops at, 75%. So instead of giving up 35% of the oxygen at the tissues, you'll give up 25%. Well, now you're missing some stuff. Well, what's that going to do to you? If you don't have a lot of CO2 being produced, that means you don't need the oxygen. And the result is, we're not going to give it to you. We're going to give you the oxygen if you need the oxygen. Well, how does this play out? If you hyperventilate, you're breathing a lot more than you should, your pH is going up. What do we have to care about that? Well, that means your brain probably isn't going to be getting oxygen that it needs, and whenever your brain doesn't get what it wants, you pass out. Which is why if you hyperventilate, you start to feel dizzy, and it's because you're starving your brain of oxygen. And because you're thinking, I'll do this, your brain's going to say, oh, you're hyperventilating. I know how to stop you, and it turns out you pass out. It's why when you have people who are freaking out, they give them a bag and say, here, breathe into the bag. And as you breathe into the bag, what you're doing is you're building up the CO2 inside of the bag so that we can counteract this shift in the curve so that you don't pass out. Who knew that you had to remember so much chemistry for this class?